Hi, Rodney Horton, how are you? Welcome to our lab at St. David's. We're doing a redo case today, and we're focusing on a device to displace the esophagus. This is Clayton here with me. Sarah and Tara are some of the nurses. Samantha's here. Dr. Gianni's going to be helping with manipulation of the esophagus. And here's if you can see the PowerPoint, here's some demographics on this patient. So this patient's a 79-year-old woman. She has a history of hypertension. She had a history of drug-resistant persistent AFib, and she underwent a fairly extensive ablation in August of this last year. Since that, of note, when we did the procedure, she had moderate to severe scarring in the left atrium. We had to ablate almost 60 minutes of actual RF time. Once we ablated in the left atrium, the AFib organized into right-sided isthmus-dependent flutter, which we ablated and terminated. And since that time, she's obviously done better than she did before, but she's had multiple episodes of what is essentially an atypical flutter, and had a presyncopal episode. When she came in after that, she was in sinus. We think that she had the symptoms of presyncope on termination of the arrhythmia and then having a pause. Her ejection fraction is 60%. LA volume index is 39 cc's per meter squared. And we did, during the first procedure, we did vein isolation. We did a 10th posterior wall isolation, ablation of the left atrial septum, floor roof, and then, of course, the right atrial flutter. The reason we selected this patient for today is that we wanted to highlight esophageal displacement, because in this case, the one thing that we really struggled with that first procedure was getting good lesions on the posterior aspect of the right inferior pulmonary vein. So we had to go back there several times because we kept getting fairly significant esophageal heating in that area. Here's a CT scan, at least one slice from a CT scan of this patient, demonstrating a fairly right-sided positioning of the esophagus. And since esophageal injury is probably one of the worst complications that can happen from left atrial ablation procedures, this is a sort of a technology that I think needs to be at least considered in some of these cases. Here's just an image of the 3D map that we did, and the ablation catheter is sort of right in a position where every time we ablated in that area, we would get fairly brisk esophageal heating, so we'd have to stop, and we were never as aggressive in this area as we'd like to do. So we selected this case because while we didn't know exactly what the cause of her arrhythmia was, it seemed reasonable to bring her back and see whether this area that we had struggled with in August wasn't actually the problem. Can we switch to live? So while you were watching other cases, we went ahead and got access to the left atrium. We did a 3D map of the left atrium, did a voltage map, and sort of highlighted some of the areas where most of the areas are electrically silent. The way this voltage map works, the red is electrically silent or very low amplitude. The purple is high amplitude, so presumably area that has normal electrical activity. And the yellow is sort of intermediate. It's not completely absent electrical activity. And as you can see right behind the right inferior pulmonary vein, there is yellow area there, which correlates with what we had seen with the case 6 months ago, where we were just struggling in that one area to get adequate lesions. Now, our circular catheter at the moment is positioned in the left atrial appendage, and the arrhythmia that the patient's in right now was the arrhythmia that she was in when she came and got on the table. As we were positioning catheters, it terminated and went to sinus, and the only thing worth mentioning there was that when the circular catheter was in the appendage, there was a lot of delay, but the appendage was not obviously isolated. And then a PAC, as we were manipulating catheters, put it right back into her clinical arrhythmia. So,
Rodney, we did not follow here. So you said, how did the patient go into sinus rhythm?
actually, with catheter manipulation, as I was putting the duodecapolar catheter into the CS, the mechanical manipulation either caused a PAC or pressure or something, and accidentally terminated. And then just as accidentally as I was getting some voltage along the septum, the patient went back into it. So this is the same arrhythmia that she was in at the beginning of the procedure, but she did terminate and go back into it during the procedure. And of note here, if you look at the electrograms, so the circular catheter, so the middle electrode, the white, is in the left atrial appendage. The yellow on the top is along the right atrium, crista terminalis.
Can you please increase the size of the recording system so we see what you're telling us?
If you go to the recording system large. Give us just a second. I should have anticipated that. Okay, so here in this view, on the right, upper right, you're seeing the live electrodes. Is this better? And what I'm pointing out is that the middle intracardiac electrogram, the white, is all circular catheter recordings. Directly below that, the white is the ablation, which is really not touching anything, so it's electrically silent. Below that is the coronary sinus electrograms, and if you notice, we are having some fairly consistent premature atrial signals from the coronary sinus. And on the very top, the yellow is the electrograms from the right atrium, sort of anterior to the crista terminalis. If you look on X-ray, you'll see where the catheter positions are right now. And this is what we found. So electrically, we wanted to show you this case because the esophageal bleeding was a problem, was a complication or difficulty in doing the case as smoothly as we wanted to in August. And so we were sort of suspicious that this area may have reconnected, and of course we were hoping that this may have actually been the cause of this arrhythmia. So if you look at the voltage map on the upper left, you can see that most of the area of, all four veins are electrically silent, they're all red. The yellow, there is yellow behind, on the posterior aspect of the right inferior pulmonary vein, and then there's some high amplitude sort of in the low interatrial septum. There's also some yellow down below the veins, sort of the low posterior wall of the left atrium.
What's your voltage settings for this map, for the map?
At the moment, the lower range for the red is at 0.1 millivolts, so this is just how this is set right now, and we can modify it any way you'd like. The upper range is 0.5 millivolts.
So, Ronnie, what's the plan? What are you going to do for this?
Well, obviously the patient was cooperative enough to be out of rhythm when she got here and was very cooperative to go back into it when we accidentally terminated it. So this is a fairly slow tachycardia technically speaking. The cycle length is well over 400 milliseconds, so it's pretty slow. The patient was not that symptomatic with it, except that she did have the presyncope, which was probably from termination. So that was her biggest symptom. And so this is either an atrial tachycardia or it's a micro-reentrant flutter. And so what we would typically do is do this voltage map, sort of understand electrically what has regained and what hasn't. Then we would typically do an entrainment map and see if we can localize, if indeed it is micro-reentrant, what the driver is for us. The other critical thing in most of the
Rodney, sorry for the interruption. Is there a chance you can increase the size of the recording system? So give it more real estate so we can see better. It's hard. I mean, I'm having trouble seeing here. I don't know if it's appearing on the big screen.
You want to see the 3D in larger view?
Okay,
that better?
thank you, much better, thank you.
Okay, so I'll just go over this again. So the white in the middle is the circular catheter. The ablation catheter is white right below the circular catheter. At the bottom is the coronary sinus with PACs that are pretty consistently happening from there. And at the top is the crista. So basically we have a patient that was in persistent AFib originally. Couldn't maintain sinus rhythm despite the Fetolite therapy at that time, had a pretty extensive ablation with persistent isolation of all of the veins in most of the posterior wall except for the area right behind the right inferior pulmonary vein. And so the two things that you have to look at in a case like this, where the patient is in a very organized rhythm, this is obviously not AFib, is what is a trigger that could have caused it. It's obviously not coming from a pulmonary vein because the veins are electrically silent, so it's a non-venous trigger. In this case, I would look very closely at the CS as potentially a target, and then also the substrate that's allowing, if it is in fact a micro-reentry flutter, the substrate that's allowing that to occur. So there's the maintenance of the arrhythmia in the form of the slow conduction, presumably, that allows for micro-reentry to occur, and the non-venous triggers, in this case non-PD triggers, that is initiated. Yes. So to do that, we would typically go to the areas where we see signal and do entrainment mapping and see if training, basically pacing slightly faster than the clinical arrhythmia, and then coming off and looking at the post-pacing interval can help. So from an ablation standpoint, that is our strategy. Now, before we do that, what I'd like to do is talk a minute about the esophagus and displacement, because that's kind of what we were mainly wanting to feature here.
Rodney, just want to summarize what you said so everyone will keep following up. So you did a voltage map. You found that most of the posterior wall had no voltage in it except a small area in the low posterior wall where it showed that some voltage which was lighting up in yellow on the map. So you are going to go ahead to ablate that, and the esophagus seems to be right there, so you want to move it, and then you will go and you will map this atrial tachycardia we're seeing. Is that correct?
That's probably the most practical way of handling this. So basically, if you look at the 3D map that's displayed, I'm very happy with it, except for the yellow area that's directly behind the right inferior pulmonary vein. This would be typically tissue that we actually would like to render completely electrically silent. It doesn't have any mechanical purpose. It's embryologically identical to the tissue from the pulmonary veins, and so we would like that silent, whether that is the source of the arrhythmia or not. And with the first procedure, the esophagus was sort of bedeviling us. It was keeping us from ablating as aggressively as we'd like to render that permanently silent. Now, what you can see on the 3D map right now is there is a yellow catheter that is sort of overlaying what we've been talking about there, and that is actually the temperature probe that is connected to a location sensor. So the reason you see that, and that, as you can see, it's lining up exactly where the area of reconnection was, is because that's exactly where the esophagus is, and as it turns out, that's where our temperature probe is. So I'm going to go on fluoro right now and talk for a minute about what you're seeing there. So I won't stay on fluoro for a moment. This is one of a number of different technologies that have been developed with the primary purpose is to move or displace the esophagus away from the area that you would like to ablate. And the esophagus, when you're under general anesthesia, typically the esophagus doesn't move. It sort of lays wherever it's laying when someone's in a supine position. If someone's awake and they swallow, it actually will move and it will wiggle a bit. And so the purpose is to mechanically, in this case, displace the esophagus away from the area you want to ablate so that you can ablate more aggressively. Now, anatomically, the esophagus is not a slender tube. It's actually sort of, when someone's supine, it's sort of flattened. And so it's kind of like a tapeworm, sort of lying along the posterior aspect of the left atrium. And it's also connected or tethered there's vasculature and there's nervous tissue, including the vagus nerve, that sort of sits right anterior to the esophagus. So when you move the esophagus, really what you're doing is you're rolling the esophagus one way or the other, because anterior to the esophagus, there is fascia, which is sort of tethering it to a position right behind the left atrium. However,
Rodney?
Go ahead.
Rodney, in the esophagus, we see that you have the tool that you're going to use to move it, but also we see an ablation catheter, which basically you use to localize on the electro-anatomical mapping system to see where the esophagus is.
It is. It's actually not an ablation catheter. It is a decapolar catheter that happens to have a sensor in it, and so you couldn't ablate from it if you wanted to, but we use that as the mechanism of visualizing the temperature probe, and not because of the electrodes, we actually have all of those covered, but because of the sensor. And so we usually do these cases without using much fluoro, really any fluoro, and to do that safely and at least to monitor temperatures, you have to have some way of locating the
Can you show us the tool outside the body? Is there a picture of it, the tools that you use to move the esophagus? Do you have any slides on, or you can show it to us with the camera outside the body so we know exactly how it works?
Yes, as we're doing this, I could have somebody pull that up. Carol. Let me talk just briefly about this particular technology. It's not the only technology out there. There's other devices and some off-label things that can be done. And the whole purpose is to simply apply some lateral force one direction or the other to make the esophagus lie a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left so you can get to an area of interest. And again, the esophagus will tend to roll. It doesn't actually move completely freely. It's still tethered to fascia just anterior to it. But the body of the esophagus can roll quite a bit to one way or the other. And that fascia can, in some patients, be fairly elastic. So it will give you the impression of not really being tethered to anything when in fact it is.
So
because the
can you show us some pictures on outside the body on how?
Yeah.
Doug?
I do think it would be useful to show us what the system looks like on the outside. But I also think it'd be useful to give us a sense as to when you move the esophagus, is it because you're rotating the device and that therefore moves it, or is it because you pull up and down?
It's both, yeah.
And when you pull up and down, that actually moves it. And then the final question is, with whatever combination of what you're doing, how much movement do you actually get?
Yeah.
And how do you determine that?
And
Yeah.
versus tenting, correct? How
Yeah.
much movement versus tenting, and how do you determine if you're tenting or moving? But Rodney, I mean, there's a lot of interest in this topic, so if we can start by showing us the device itself and how it works, and then we can answer the other questions.
Yeah.
I can answer. So what Doug asked, so you move it by both advancing and sometimes rotating. Most of the time just advancing and pulling back. If you see that Ronnie, because it does fluoroless as a multipolar catheter glued to a temperature probe, so that you can visualize that on the mapping system without fluoro. But we always have another temperature probe. Most of the time you move the esophagus away, but we had maybe a couple of cases where you move the wall, but part of the esophagus, the other side of the wall is still close to, yes, so you kind of stretch the wall, but we're not moving it.
Yeah.
So it's important to have another catheter there that give you an idea of that, or to verify that with intracardiac echo, because most of the time move the esophagus as a unit, but there are cases where you just stretch the wall and you still have an edge of the wall close to where you want to ablate.
And I think it's safe to say if all you're doing is elongating the esophagus, or if you're creating an ellipsoidal cross-section, that if anything, that's going to make it bigger so that you have more area that you need to worry about. And
Well,
so I think the potential advantage here is if you move it up and down, then it's less likely to be stretched.
yeah, and the majority of the time is up and down. There are cases, but but most of the time, actually, the stretch is minimal, but there are cases where you can actually see that is important. So you have to kind of verify that it's not just because one side move away that you have to assume, but you can see it.
Okay, so I think we have a picture of the device here.
So this is a picture of this particular technology, and so Andrea answered some of those questions, and I would say that, well, first of all, this is a very simple, very low-tech device. The only real tech in here is that it's made of an alloy, nitinol alloy, that will actually become more straight when it's cold, and then it becomes more curved when it's at body temperature. So that's actually useful. The other thing is that you should put in an NG tube, a typical NG tube, place it through the mouth, through an orogastric tube, and then once the tube is placed, then you place this inside the tube. So it's safer to do it that way to avoid trauma. There were several questions there that I think I've heard Doug ask, and I agree that in some patients the esophagus really doesn't move much at all. Typically that's in patients that have had previous heart surgery. So they've had surgery, there's a lot of inflammation that occurs from the heart surgery, and I find that the esophagus is pretty much tethered there. And so yes, you can kind of tint it one direction or the other, but you're not really going to move it. If someone has not had heart surgery, I don't think that that's an entirely true statement. I think that the esophagus will roll, and the body of the esophagus, which can be confirmed with barium injection into the esophagus, the whole body of it does really move. Now, there is a fascia anterior to it which will keep it from moving completely. And if the fascia is elastic, so it'll roll quite a bit. And I've seen it move up to what looks like 5 or 6 centimeters in some patients. But if the patient's had previous heart surgery, that's usually not true. And so I would absolutely agree that if it is not mobile, then all you're accomplishing here is stretching this thing out and increasing the surface area that could potentially be subject to thermal injury or ablation injury. The other thing is that with this particular technology, there's 2 ways of moving the esophagus. The way we were first taught to do it was to torque it, basically to clock it or counterclock it and flip it around. And the problem I've seen with that is that it tends to build up a lot of torque without moving, and then all of the torque gets transmitted all at once, and so the thing does a complete 360. So it ends up exactly where it flips around, it goes right back to where it was originally. What I found is more reliable, as Andrea was pointing out, was there's a minor curve down at the bottom of it, and then there's a more of a major curve that's on the opposite direction. So what we found is that advancing the entire device tends to slide it more to, in this case, the left direction, which would move it away from...
Rodney, we have a question.
So,
Rodney, we have a question from the audience.
demonstrate that.
I'm interested to learn more about how you're going to determine that atrial tachycardia. So, in that electrogram that you have, is that from proximal to distal CS activation? And looks like your appendage is late.
Yes.
And,
That is correct. So,
okay, so do you have any information on the right atrial entrainment map or activation map? I mean, you don't have any activation map information, obviously, in the left atrium because of the dense scar. And also, how about high-density mapping? Do you think high-density mapping would be helpful in the left atrium here?
We did, before we went to the left atrium, which is sort of our usual custom in minimizing fluoroscopy, we did do a map, a fast anatomical map of the right atrium. We did not get any electrical information at that time, and at the moment we don't have any catheters capable of doing it. We would have to go back to the right atrium to do that. It's an excellent point because there is very little electrical activity left in the left atrium. It's very true. There is area where we've talked about that's at least coincides with where we struggled with the last, the first ablation. But we also have the coronary sinus. So to answer your first question, the down at the bottom, sort of the light blue, light green electrograms that you see, the ones on top are the proximal coronary sinus, the ones on bottom are the distal coronary sinus. The very bottom one doesn't have. Can you go to the larger view of the?
So Rodney, we go back to the esophagus issue. You want to show us like live how you move it and what the exact rotation or movements that you?
Yeah, they already, looks like they already moved. Okay, so it's pulling back, and
Okay.
it goes back to where it was.
So if you can show us how do you do it actually?
Yeah, so
on
look
the-
at just by advancing, look where it is. This is where it was originally.
Okay.
Now it's advancing.
Okay.
See, I completely push it away.
All right. So when you do that, is there a way to be sure that the trailing edge of the esophagus is not still in your field of ablation? How can you tell?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
If the trailing edge of the esophagus, so the opposite edge where the tool
Yes.
is not is, how can you make sure you're not still in the field of ablation?
Well, obviously, so I just moved my ablation catheter over to that area where the signal persists, and you can see it on the recording system. And as you can see before, if you pull the temperature, if you pull the esophageal displacement to back, previously everything was
I
sort
think
of
that,
right
yeah,
on top
that's a
of
pretty
where we were
big change.
one and two
Yeah.
plate, and then advance it back.
So,
Yeah.
as I said before,
Now Doug
Yeah.
made an excellent point, and that is, if this really isn't moving, it's simply you're pushing on one side of the right edge of the esophagus, now we're pushing on the left edge of the esophagus, you could have a false sense of security. Although we have done this with barium paste in the esophagus, if the actual lumen does move, I think the part of the esophagus in someone who's not had surgery that does not move is the vagus nerve and the arterial supplies of the esophagus, which lies directly between the esophagus and the left atrium. And that doesn't. But that can be fairly elastic. And so the esophagus itself can move quite a bit. And in some cases, and this isn't the only technology that exists for this, there's a device that inflates and will displace as well, and does it a little more aggressively, I think, than this does. But the point is, moving the esophagus in someone who's not had previous surgery is possible. It does allow you to ablate in areas that you would struggle with or find esophageal temperatures happening and limiting your ablation energy without using the
so,
technology.
Rodney, we have a question from Doug and then from Vivek. So Doug,
so,
please go ahead.
honestly, so as I said before, you can verify that with eyes. You can look at the edges with eyes. Typically, however, with the other probe that he has there, the temperature probe, if you just stretch the esophagus, that probe will stay where it was before. It will not move much.
Yeah.
So when you see everything moving, usually it's a good sign that
Yeah.
actually you're not stretching the esophagus, you're moving the body as a unit.
Yeah. Yeah, again, looking with the esophagus or barium or something with the ice or
You could
barium
do- yeah.
is important because, you're going to go aggressive with ablation here. The main idea is to be able to,
Yes. Yes.
use 30 watts or whatever you want to ablate. And if there's any chance you're left with some part of the esophagus in your field, this will result in,
Yes.
worse problems than not using these tools at all. So Doug and then Vivek.
I think you've kind of already answered my question, and that is, for a long time you've used eyes to tell you where the esophagus is. And you just referred to it again, and I'm just wondering, to me, the main issue here is how do you know that you really moved it as opposed to stretching it? And so the question then is, can you really tell on ice? Now,
Yeah.
obviously, it's kind of a rotational motion, and so it's not like you're going to be cross-sectioned to the esophagus,
Yeah.
but still you see something.
Yeah. I do. And also, I want to say, so this issue of the width of the esophagus is important even if you don't stretch it. We have cases where with the ice we see that the temperature probe was on one side, but the esophagus span the other way around. So it's probably a good idea, regardless if you displace or not, to always have a good idea of the width of the esophagus. And ice is a simple way to do it.
Can you manipulate the ICE probe now and see some change in the image with the manipulation of the esophagus? Is that possible running?
Do you,
At the moment, I have
Yes, the ice.
catheter in the right atrium.
Yeah.
And the left atrium, the area where you can see sort of what looks like bubbles with that saline, is the ablation catheter sort of sitting in the middle of the left atrium. Directly sort of up west from that is the posterior aspect of the left atrium. And below that, you see this area that is somewhat more lucent than the area directly above it, and that's actually where the esophagus is. And it's right there, yep.
Yeah, you can see the
right
probe.
there. And so if Carola could, we'll move the esophagus back to where it was before. I won't move the ice catheter. And I think that the important points here, see it just completely goes out of the way. So we don't see it at all.
You see how
at
it
least in
kind
this
of went away from
So
it.
I'm going to find it again. So I'm having to plot the ice because predictably it's more on the right side. Now, advance the displacement. Hang on, let me just get a little bit better view. It's a little bit of artifact, but I'm going to leave it right there and go ahead and displace it back on fluoro. We're going to advance it again. And it completely, well, not completely, mostly goes out of view. I think the points here are, I used to not even be a believer in this. I used to think that the esophagus never moved at all, and I've seen cases where it was so dramatic, there's no way of avoiding it, particularly if you use a barium or something like that. I also do agree with every other point here that you don't want a false sense of security. You don't want to say, oh, it's a temperature probe way over here. I don't have anything to worry about because the esophagus is not a straw. It's particularly when someone's supine, it's kind of flat. And so it's much wider, it's a much more wider target than you may realize. And so ice is helpful. Probably the most definitive thing I would say is that you just injecting barium. If you're really worried, that will show you almost all of the width of the esophagus and would be able to convince you definitely. Now in this case, we have a temperature probe with a sensor catheter in there, and that's actually a little bit helpful also because it gives you some appreciation for the width or some of the width of the
So, Vivek?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of comments. First, I really like esophageal deviation. I think, in my mind, it's still the best way of ensuring that you don't have damage. A few other points. I think the points that have been made about stretching the esophagus is a very important one. I mean, we've been deviating the esophagus using different tools, but the point is when you deviate the esophagus, the first thing that happens is stretching. And what's really interesting for me is that patient to patient, there's significant variability in terms of the amount of stretching. And the way, at least for me, we always put barium in the esophagus so you can see the full extent. And what's interesting is in some patients, the trailing edge tracks very quickly and easily. In other patients, you have a huge amount of stretch. It's only with really extensive deviation does the trailing edge move over a little bit. So I think it's really, and it's a point that was already raised, but it's critical to really understand where the trailing edge. The last point really quickly, we have a paper that's coming out where we were doing esophageal deviation. We had barium in the esophagus. We looked at the trailing edge of the esophagus where we had a temperature probe that was specifically placed. We looked at the point of ablation, measured the distance, and tried to understand how great of a distance do you need to be away before you don't see esophageal heating. And what we see, not surprisingly, the further away, of course, the less chance of heating. But what's interesting is that it's only after you get about 2 centimeters away from the trailing edge,
2 centimeters?
2 centimeters away, that you can be sure you'll have no heating. If you're, let's
When you
say,
say
1
no heating,
centimeter away.
no heating, like no increase at all, but you don't need that, is it? Even if you...
I understand. I'm just giving you the data. And then if you are, say, 1 centimeter away, and in half the cases, we see heating. Now, heating doesn't, as you pointed out, doesn't necessarily mean ulceration and doesn't necessarily mean transmural necrosis. So what exactly is the right number? I think this is something we need to understand better. But the point is, you really have to move it away fairly extensively before you can be sure that you're not going to get any thermal effects, let's say.
I think it's very important points. Doug?
Oh, I'm intrigued by the echo densities that are between the sheath and the septum. And I'm wondering if you're just running some flow through your catheter tip there. When you had the ice image larger, it was a little bit more apparent. My question was whether or not that is just some bubbles that are coming through, or if there's something else going on there.
You're talking about
Talking about the, what looks like bubbles that are,
Well, I'm talking about what I hope is just
okay.
bubbles.
bubbles, they're bubbles.
yeah.
You know, just bubbles coming through the sheath.
Yeah, they're bubbles. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's an ablation catheter, an open irrigated ablation
It's
catheter.
an irrigated catheter, yeah.
Some of that is just the irrigation in 2 cc's a minute from the catheter itself.
So you didn't use gastrografin or barium, right? So, no.
Grapefruit.
So are you just using the fluoro imaging, or are you using echo? How do you make the determination? Okay, so both to determine that you've moved the esophagus far enough away that you can feel comfortable. And do you still monitor the temperature at the
Yeah,
distance?
that's what
And,
yes.
and have you been able to demonstrate that you can titrate energy to a higher level?
Yeah, so in general, you know, the cases we've done, we can go up to 40. There are cases where we tap even a little farther. So we're being able to ablate with more power, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So, you know, Rodney, you know, obviously lots of questions and interest in this whole concept of moving the esophagus, and mostly revolving around whether actually moving it or just stretching it. So I think we were able to tackle most of these questions. So I think we were, is there anything you would like, because we're going to be wrapping up soon, is there anything you want to show us or tell us before we go somewhere else?
Well, unrelated to the esophagus, we had some time on our hands before we went live. It's Friday the 13th, so what possibly could go wrong on Friday the 13th with live cases? But we did do an entrainment map, and the first place that we did entrain was on the poster wall where we had talked about, and it actually wasn't that early, so it wasn't driving this. This actually is coming from the appendage side of the cubital ridge. So that happens to be where this one is. So we haven't delivered any lesions yet, but we wanted to discuss this. And this isn't to show you this is how you move the esophagus. I think it's just to begin people's thought, as Vivek said, that movement of the esophagus is possible in most patients. And if it moves, the further it moves, the lower the risk. But until you get completely away from the area that you're ablating, over 2 centimeters, as he said, then the risk is still there. So you do have to be careful. You still have to use all of the usual safety measures that you would normally use. But what we have found is that in areas that you might have temperatures shoot up very quickly, if you do displace the esophagus, even somewhat, you'll find that you can actually burn a little bit harder, a little longer in those areas, and hopefully get more permanent lesions if that's what your goal was.
Ronnie, did you map the tachycardia already, or you're going to do it now?
We did.
You did, so because I think they want to see it.
Yeah, I can certainly do it. It was,
Okay.
So we've already displaced the esophagus. Can you just go to RAO down? Because now let's just go ahead and train it here. I wasn't sure if you guys wanted to see this part.
So that's a little more displacement, as you see. See that? So advancing a little more.
Where this is coming from isn't near the esophagus. It doesn't really matter. But the point of this, can you go ahead and train right there, ablation, please? You have to go a little faster, please. There are PACs from the CS that keep messing up our drives. Off. Okay, so that's within 3 milliseconds of the clinical arrhythmia. So, and obviously there's electrical activity in this area. If you look on ultrasound, so usually the best view I find for this is to go across the tricuspid valve and then slowly block until you've opened up the appendage. So what you're looking at there is, at the very top is a little bit tangential, but a cross-section of the aorta. And then below that,
I think that
the
they've
dense tissue is
treated the
a
topic well.
tangential slice through the left ventricle. The loosened part is the appendage, and you're actually seeing a longitudinal view of the appendage, and you can see my circular catheter right there. And then there's something that's pointed up that looks kind of like a Q-tip, and that is actually the cubital ridge. And then directly below and to the left is the left superior pulmonary vein. And so, as you can see, our ablation catheter is
Right.
actually it's on the venous.
So Rodney, can we talk about this AT and the map and tell us what, show us a map, activation map, or what you plan to do for it?
Well, in this case, I think it's an atypical flutter. I think this is an area of micro reentry, and when we entrained on the posterior wall and the low areas with a lot of electrical activity, there was at least 60 milliseconds. They weren't matching up with the cycle length of the tachycardia. They were at least 60 milliseconds longer. This was the area where it entrained perfectly to this area. So there's a little bit of a risk, as it were, of isolating the appendage without intending to by ablating this area. But this is clearly coming from certainly around the base of the left atrial appendage in this case. And the best entrainment map I saw was actually on the appendage side of the Coumadin ridge. So if you look down at the ultrasound
So the
image,
basically the show before it was from
see two shafts that are entering the left atrial appendage, and one to the left is the one where the ablation catheter.
Well, if you look at the activation.
Andrea, do you want to, Andrea, can you please, do you have any comments on the circuit you think, or where this is coming from, and any?
Ronnie, why don't you show the pacing that you did from the Coumadin ridge before, blow it up so they can see the returning cycle, so that they compare. You know, so this is an example where activation can be misleading because of the patient has used extensive ablation.
So just confirm the cycling, just update.
You can show the one you did before.
It's a little variable because of the PACs, but if you don't look at, that's the PAC, that one.
Yeah.
Use the other ones. So we have a cycling 490 milliseconds. It's a really slow tachycardia. And so let's entrain from the tip of the ablation catheter. With regard to our case, so the patient was in an atypical flutter. Can you pull, so as you can see here on the screen, we are doing an entrainment map of this very slow rhythm. The site of entrainment that we were testing right there was, as I was describing before, sort of the septal side of the base of the left atrial appendage. And that had essentially a perfect entrainment map. Now go to the first ablation lesion. So right after we were no longer alive, we finally got an opportunity to ablate, and slow down this sweep, please. So within 13 seconds of the first application, it slowed and terminated. Go forward, please. Forward, please. So now that terminated that one arrhythmia. And if you also look here before it terminates, you can see there's a little bit of variability there. And what that is coming from is some fairly frequent premature atrial contractions. The earliest location that I could see was CS56. So I think that there was some electrical activity before septum. So proximal CS, mid CS was having some activity there. So once we terminated this arrhythmia, which basically simply shows that we were eliminating one area of substrate that was capable of slow conduction and had the flutter. We then pulled over to the right atrium and ablated and isolated at least up to CS78 on there, because I felt like that was a non-venous trigger. There was one other flutter, and someone else had asked earlier about doing voltage map or training from the right atrium, which was actually a very excellent suggestion, because as we were ablating in the CS, the patient went back into an atrial arrhythmia. The activation was different the site length was slower, and the activation was clearly distinct from what had been seen before. And when we entrained in the CS, it was not very good. When we entrained on the high right atrial septum, it was perfect. And so when we ablated in that area, as you can see, the blue dots on the RV side, or sorry, right atrial side, that's now organized and terminated. So we've done those two things. The appendage remains delayed, as you can see, but the delay really isn't any different than what we saw when we briefly had sinus rhythm at the beginning of the procedure. So we have not really altered the mechanical function of the appendage, but we did ablate that one area. We ended up ablating more than one. Show me RAO, you down. So the white 3D point is the first lesion that we applied, and that's the one that terminated. As you can see, that's sort of the septal, sort of the confluence between the cumin ridge, the left atrial roof, and the appendage. And so really one spot where it slowed and terminated that arrhythmia. I went ahead and ablated a little bit more just to make sure that it would be transmural.
Thank you.
We haven't seen any arrhythmia since.
Thank you, Rodney. Very nice job.